Hello, I'm Dr. Lewis Hoffman of Saybrook University. This video lecture is for a History and Systems of Psychology class that I teach at Saybrook University. The focus of this video lecture is on an overview of the major paradigms in the history of psychology. I want to begin with a few cautionary notes though. First, if you're not familiar with some of the ideas in this lecture, such as Premodernism, Modernism, and Postmodernism, it can be heady stuff for some people and take a little while to sink in. That's okay. We will continue touching back to some of this throughout the class. This provides some of a kind of template to be able to look at and understand, or a lens to be able to look at and understand some of the changes that have happened in the history of psychology. And then the most important cautionary note maybe is that in order to talk about all of history and grouping it into basically three periods, we're going to be taking in some overgeneralizations and simplifications as a way to identify patterns. So there are going to be exceptions to each of the periods that we talk about. There's going to be limitations to some of the generalizations that we make about these and some of the concepts. So please just keep that in mind. If you find that if you think of an exception in a period of time that didn't apply to it, that's fine. That is to be expected, that there's always going to be exceptions to categorizing in ways such as this. But hopefully looking at some of these broad patterns over time will help to make some sense out of the history of psychology as well. Start with a quote from Ken Gergen. This is from his book, The Saturated Self. I am also uneasy speaking of periods of history or cultural conditions in general. It is customary to write in these terms, but there is nothing that is written about periods, places, or cultures that cannot be discredited. One can always find strong emanations of the past in what is new. This is very consistent with what I was just referring to, and it's important just to keep in mind, again, there's limitations in talking about periods. There's always going to be exceptions. And certainly when we get to postmodernism and even modernism, we're going to see emanations of them in earlier periods in history. Also a quote by Friedrich Nietzsche. All things are subject to interpretation. Whichever interpretation prevails at a given time is a function of power and not truth. There are no facts, only interpretations. And then a quote by Becker. And this quote from Becker, for a little context, this was from an interview with Becker when he was in the hospital after he'd been diagnosed with terminal cancer. I would like to talk about some misgivings I have about my earlier work. One of the big defects with my early work is that I tried to accommodate ideas to the opportunities of the 60s to be relevant. Recently, I tried to present an empirical picture of man irrespective of what we need or want. Today, I hold that the only honest praxis is theory. There's a number of very interesting things in this quote. One is Becker really has a good understanding of the relevance of theory. That theory is more than just something we do intellectually. Theory always has impact. And that's a foundational concept that I think is important when we're looking at the history of psychology and psychology in general, is that theory does have impact. It is not something that is just separate or just an intellectual activity. It informs what we do, it impacts what we do on a daily basis. But he also recognized that there is a tendency to write to the time, to what's going to, in a way that's going to be heard in the time, to ideas that fit with the times. And he acknowledges this through his own writing. But you also see his reservations about that, there's ways we need to try and think and go beyond that as well. Okay, so a very brief overview. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about Premodernism, Modernism, and Postmodernism and as three primary paradigms throughout the history. Again, of course, not everything fit into nice and neatly into these packages in that time frame. There's always exceptions, and there are a lot of limitations in talking about many very complex theories in these three paradigms. Another really important limitation that I should identify at the beginning is that this is something that fits for Western thought. It does not fit for all of world history. There may be some similarities in other cultures around the world, But even within Western cultures, there certainly are some variations around this, but this is something that fits much better with European, Western, and then later United States thinking than it does to some other cultures across the world. So when we talk about premodernism, this is basically the beginning of time, some would say up through about the 1650s, somewhere in this area. And what we really see is the primary epistemology, and we're going to look at a lot of these periods largely through the lens of epistemology. The primary epistemology was revelation or religion. So it was based on some type of spiritual knowing, and that varied from different religions to religions. But it's hard to understand the development of Western thought apart from Christianity, because Christianity has been the most influential religion on the development of Western thought. But also Christianity has been strongly shaped by how Western thought has developed. So there's a back and forth with this, an influence going in both directions that we need to be aware of. But we'll talk about this some in terms of Christianity as our primary model, because it is throughout history it's been the most influential Western religion for most of the periods we're going to be discussing. Modernism is typically thought to be beginning around 1650 and going through about 1950, though I would place it much later. I do think we're seeing a lot of influence of postmodern and coming in the 1950s and even earlier. Certainly we see some postmodern type ideas in Nietzsche and others, Kierkegaard as well. But there's always going to be a transition period. And I don't see modernism as fading out from being the most dominant influence until much later than the 1950s. However, the 1950s is more commonly put out there, and though I disagree with it, there are many scholars that would put this around 1950. And what we see as the primary epistemology here is reason and empiricism. And we'll unpack those terms a little bit here shortly about what we're getting at with reason and empiricism. I'm sure you have some ideas of what these mean, but we'll talk about them in an historical context a little too. Then postmodernism is 1950s through current times, or in my timeline I would place it again a little later than 1950s. And what we see as the epistemological perspective here is epistemological diversity or epistemological pluralism. Epistemological pluralism is the term that I've seen used more often, but I like the epistemological diversity, this idea as well. This is something that Scott Churchill will talk about within the framework of humanistic psychology, and I do think it's a nice term as well. And really these are getting at some similar ideas. Now, when we think about the stages of development, it's important to realize, again, this is an oversimplification, but we can think of some periods that do apply. One is a deconstruction of the previous paradigm. And often, the deconstruction of the previous paradigm may come before the formal development of the new theory that's going to replace it. It's certainly going to start before that. So we see this deconstruction of the previous paradigm. A second phase, we can kind of think of it as a development, the construction or an assignment of epistemology, the formal development, which is really development of methodology, and then we see an internal critique that often emerges as we get more of a formal development. Often this internal critique and the deconstruction of the previous paradigm overlap in ways. So if you think about the internal critique of premodernism is going on while there's the deconstruction of premodernism by modernism. So that's kind of the overlap that I'm talking about there. But so these are different phases. Why I think this is particularly important is because with postmodernism, I would argue that the deconstruction of the previous paradigm, the critique of the previous paradigm, that was the beginnings of postmodernism by many people has been misunderstood as postmodernism. And so many people have not been able to develop a good sense of what postmodernism is because they focus on this early development. Before there was as much formal development within postmodernism, they mistake in this early deconstruction as what postmodernism is. But as all theories do, postmodernism has evolved some over time. So some keys to understanding premodernism, modernism, and postmodernism, some of the language that's used. There will be this language of capital T truth and ultimate truth or universal truth. Also, often the language of metanarratives is often used with this. What this type of truth is really talking about is a type of truth that is true across all time, all places, all contexts, and it's generally understood that this truth can be accessed to some, at least to a large degree. So we can attain capital truth is often purported by people that will speak of this, not always. And then there's small t truth, relative truth, local truth, constructivisms, which can be personal, social, cultural constructivisms. So when we can talk about and think about these different types of truth then, truth that is seen to be more universal and truth that is more relative. And we use truth a lot of times in different ways. So truth has become more of a complex topic as we take different approaches to it over time. When we think of premodernism, the epistemology, again, is revelation, direct revelation. This can be in different forms. It can be direct revelation of the sacred scriptures, for example. It can be through natural theology for some, other signs and symbols from God. But what is assumed is that there's direct revelation from God or some type of supreme being or some type of ultimate knowing that can be attained. Now, faith here is generally pre-rational. What I mean by that is it's not dependent upon being rational. It doesn't have to be rational to be true. And this is really important to understand in distinguishing how religion was understood in pre-modern times versus modern times. Again, talking in overgeneralizations and simplifications because there was huge variance in how these were understood in pre-modern and modern times. But there are some ways that we can see how the understanding of this concept of faith has changed based on the paradigm that was most dominant at the time. And in pre-modern times, faith was more of something that was pre-rational. We know because we know. We know because of the direct relationship from God. It's not something we have to rationally understand. So the methodology in pre-modern times tends to be focused around the interpretation of revelation. So how do we interpret the sacred scriptures that were revealed by God? How do we interpret natural theology? How do we interpret other communication from God or supreme beings or other types of universal knowledge? This is what is going to be the methodology of the pre-modern period. The authority then is going to be the church and religious leaders, or in other words, those in closest proximity to the truth of the text, the interpreters of the text, and also the people who could read the text. Now keep in mind that most of premodernism was prior to the printing press, and so few people could read, few people could interpret the text directly, and so there was a reliance upon religious authority to be able to have a closer connection with truth. So truth was closely connected to religion. And keep in mind that when you look at the sacred scriptures of these early religions, they spoke to things beyond just what we today would think of as religion. Now, this is one of the confusions that often happens in more contemporary times around interpreting scriptures. But there were health codes that you can see, though maybe not always clearly labeled as that, but there were health codes that were in the sacred scriptures. Now, sometimes what was originally intended as a health code is interpreted as a spiritual law. And so this is where we get some really problematic ideas coming from religion at times, from the misinterpretation of what was maybe intended more as a health code, again, revealed from God in the religious interpretation of it. Might be a different interpretation today, but health codes being interpreted as spiritual codes. So, close proximity to the religious leaders is what gives us the connection with truth. It's how we know. And this is not just for religious truth, it's for many truths. So when you think about that transition to modernism, thinking ahead, you probably can think of stories from histories, movies, other things, where there was this tension because the church expected to have authority over things that today, typically the church is not expected to have authority over the sciences, over many other aspects of life. The church had control over because it was the primary authority in the ways of knowing in many different ways. Now, the model of human was often around the idea of the soul. I say this with some caution, though, because this really is more of an idea that emerged around the time of Plato. And many will argue that the Judeo-Christian idea of the soul really is a Platonic idea. It really comes from Plato because you don't see the idea of the soul so much in the Old Testament. This is something that's more the New Testament, and particularly this is more of the New Testament and St. Paul, who was trained, who was classically educated and would have been educated in the writings of Socrates, Plato, and others. So many will argue that the idea of the soul that now is so deeply rooted in Christianity actually is an idea that comes from Plato. Of course, many religious scholars will also dispute that. But there is a model for humans that throughout much of Premodernism, particularly after the time of Plato and the writing of St. Paul of the Christian scriptures, of the soul. What will save us? Well, God will save us. So what will save us from all these different problems that we face? In Premodernism, it's God. Then we can think a little bit here. There's not going to obviously be that deconstruction. The construction, these ideas developed over time. The idea of the interpretation of scriptures, for example, that's something that developed more in later Premodernism. Early Premodernism is going to be the establishment of the scriptures. But then later it's going to be the construction, how do you interpret, how do you use methodology to interpret. And then later there's going to be some internal critiques about some of the limitations of interpretations, etc. This led to many religious councils looking and trying to clarify and establish what are the cornerstones of faith that we really know that these are true and that we can agree upon, and what are the things that we're not so sure about. So as we're going through that process, there's a lot of internal critique going on, and these are also responses to the critiques that are happening. And by internal critique, I mean critique within people that fit with that pre-modern paradigm. Okay. So pre-modernism's understanding of revealed truth, different than a more modernist approach to postmodernism. So this is kind of pointing ahead to that modernism. Keep in mind, modernism is going to have more of a rationalistic scientific faith. So we can see what is often referred today as fundamentalism as really being more of a, what we could say, modernist premodernism. Obviously, it's not modernist in the sense that we'll talk about in a minute, but it is applying more of a rationalistic scientific approach to understanding scriptures, faith, ideas such as this. For example, one of the things that is talked about still today, but was very common in the modernist period, is the idea of apologetics. Apologetics is the rational defense of faith. Now, the rational defense of faith is not necessary from a pre-modern context, because rational is inferior to the way of knowing of the pre-modern period. It's inferior to knowing through faith. So by introducing some of these modernist concepts and their influence on pre-modernism, as well as pre-modernism carried over into the modernist period, we see some different approaches to faith emerge. And what a lot of times is talked about as faith in religious context in contemporary times really is quite different than the way faith would have been understood in pre-modern times. There's a much more rationalistic integration there, even for many that will, approaches that will otherwise kind of eschew reason, even education, science. There's still a strong rationalistic influence that occurs there. And we can think of this as a difference between the idea of mythos and logos, with mythos being more the premodernism, logos being more the modernism. And mythos understands religious stories as allegory, and truth is not dependent upon them being literally true. So a fictional story can be true. It's not literally true, but it can be true because it's talking about a basic truth. It's talking about a fundamental truth of human nature, of reality. What some scholars will argue is that in the pre-modern time, it was understood that stories were more allegory, that they were not literally true. Another way to think about this is that it's often argued that when you think about how knowledge was passed on in pre-modern times, most people couldn't read. It's much easier to remember stories than it is to memorize a book. So if you were to read a textbook on psychology versus reading a group of stories that spoke to the ideas of psychology, you're probably going to remember more of the stories than you're going to remember of the text factual information from psychology. Stories help for us to be able to remember. So it can be argued that a lot of these early religious literature was developed as ways to carry truths, but not be literally true, but carry truths through stories that are more easy to remember and pass on from generation to generation. But now as mythos was put into modern times, mythos was misunderstood as logos, with the idea that logos is more of a rational, scientific way of knowing. So turn religious stories into truths that could be rationally and scientifically interpreted, and turn stories that were not intended to be seen as literally true into being interpreted as being literally true. Again, there's a lot of debate about this within religious communities. Certainly many religious communities would not agree with this and maybe even find such suggestions to be offensive. But this is one of the perspectives that is often brought about in understanding how to interpret these stories. Now, the mythos to logos had an impact on religion. As scriptures moved from mythos to logos, the interpretation of scriptures became more literal. So many religious scholars and other scholars will argue that scriptures are often interpreted more literally today than what they were back in the time when they first were developed, first were written down. In mythos, truth was not literal facts, but meaning. In logos, truth was understood as literal facts. So again, we've turned symbols into literal meanings, thus confusing things in this perspective. Rational or scientific interpretations of logos then leads to more formal interpretive principles for interpreting these scriptures, which often is connected with the idea of hermeneutics. Some of you may be familiar with the idea of hermeneutics from a psychological perspective. Hermeneutics also has been talked about for a long time in the academy as being ways of interpreting sacred scriptures. So hermeneutic courses and will be present in a lot of theological schools, for example, as ways to learn how to interpret the scriptures. So this has brought about what can almost be seen as a new religious science of rationalism, that again is very different from what we saw in pre-modern times. But at the same time, certain scientific or rational approaches were rejected, and it's not always clear as to how some are accepted and some are rejected. For example, historical criticism, scientific criticism, literary criticism are often connected with the idea of higher criticism, different ways to try and interpret sacred scriptures, but within some religious perspectives, historical or scientific or literary criticism is seen as being heretical, because we should be able to interpret scriptures more literary and not have to worry so much about the historical context, about the literary context, about how science might influence the way that we interpret scriptures. So this again becomes an important tension, and this is still around today. It was not all that long ago that there were churches that split over their perspective on how to interpret scriptures and whether to use historical criticism and other forms of interpretation. Now, as we see this, the transition from pre-modern to modern times, Galileo is a great martyr. Galileo, a great example of a martyr. Galileo was not attempting to contradict or overthrow the church necessarily. That was not his approach, but talking about ideas that fit with modernism, and suffered a great deal of consequences for it. But as we start to see this transition from pre-modern to modern, there's a crisis of epistemology. There's a crisis of authority. We don't know who to trust, who has the right perspective on truth. And there's a crisis of meaning. Where do we find meaning in life if we can't trust these old forms of meaning and these old forms of knowledge? So the transition between periods is a time of great anxiety. In modernism, the epistemology is reason and senses, and these were integrated some over time. The senses is empiricism. We think of empiricism a little bit differently today, but as postmodernism we'll talk about, and we'll get to in a little bit, the language is socially constructed and it changes over time. Meanings do change, but empiricism early on was really talking about knowing through the senses. And there was debate at times between different schools of thought in the early modernist period about which was the right way of knowing. Is reason a superior way of knowing, or is the senses a more appropriate way of knowing? And there was debate between these, and there was some middle ground. Eventually, these became much more combined. The method, logic and empiricism. Logic is kind of the methodology of reason. Empiricism is more that development of a methodology for understanding through the senses. These get wedded to some degree in what we think of as the scientific method. And if you think about the scientific method, how that's understood, it makes sense. You see both the shades of empiricism and logic in there, the reason and the senses in there. That we're measuring things, that we have to use our senses to be able to measure, but we apply a certain degree of logical method to how we go about doing this. So the scientific method really comes out of this modern period, and it makes sense how it developed in the way that it did. So the authority shift then is to the university, to scholars, to politicians. These are more of the people that we can trust. Politicians, because they are educated through the university, typically. So this is why politicians can often be seen as authority. They have a certain degree of credibility as a scholar as well, too. So this is a big shift. You can see why there can be some conflict between the academy, universities, and religion, given some of this context, and certainly there was during this time, and some of this remains through this day. When we think about pre-modernism and modernism, we've already talked about this some, the idea of apologetics, the rational defense of faith. There's kind of a different idea of natural theology that emerges in modernism, knowing through what we experience in nature. The idea of a rational faith, which again, a rational faith is a modernist faith. It's not a pre-modern faith. Pre-modern faith doesn't, through pre-modern faith, the idea of rational faith doesn't make much sense. And we also see more of the development of formal theology, systematic theologies, that in some of my previous training read through these huge volumes of systematic theology that are developed in great detail, thousands of pages that are all supposed to be just interpreting the sacred scriptures, basically, an extrapolation from them, connected to them. But there's a lot more that is developed in them. So modernism is bringing much more of a rational type structure to them in the modern period. But systematic theology, the idea of a systematic theology, is more of a modernist concept, for those of you that are familiar with this idea of systematic theology. But yet, I would also point out, we keep coming back to this idea of religion, again, because religion has been so closely connected, and particularly Christianity, so closely connected with how Western thought developed. The model of human in this modern period is the machine and later the computer. These make good models for the modern period. What will save us? Well, science will save us, machines will save us, technology will save us. And certainly you see a lot of this in the modern period. It's no surprise that in the modern period, part of what we see emerging is a lot of these utopia myths. The idea of the fountain of youth and these different things, that you can see these emerging out of that transition around different ideas of what will save us, around different ideas of how to attain and view the good life. And a lot of these utopian myths drew a lot on ideas that were drawn from science and technology and different things. So, but utopian myths take a different turn as we get to postmodernism. As we get to postmodernism, the pursuit of these utopias, the pursuit of the fountain of youth, often is connected with a corruption that is very dangerous. So we start to see how a lot of these ideas are even played out in our myths, our literature, our movies. As we talk about phases here, we have a deconstruction phase. So the early part was deconstructing premodernism. We won't go into that too much. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the next transition. Then the construction, and we talked about this some already, from reason and senses to logic and empiricism to the scientific method. And then the internal critique. There certainly was recognition more of the limitations of modernism. And this makes sense why this was needed when you think about the atomic bomb, for example. The atomic bomb was the bomb to end all wars. That's how it was talked about. The bomb that would end all wars. So these huge weapons of destruction, we were to be terrified enough by them that we would never have any war. Well, how did that work out? It didn't work out. Same thing as science was going to save us from all these diseases. Well, it hasn't worked out. So there was some internal critique wrestling with this, going on at the same time as an external critique coming and a deconstruction of modernism. So the idea of method was heightened in the modernist period. Method became much more important, which makes sense because methods are developed largely through a rational or logical process. And the correct application of method is what leads to truth. Now, we still see that, right? The correct application of the scientific method leads to truth. We see that in psychology, right? That the correct application of the scientific method in the form of randomized clinical trials, for example, will tell us which is the best therapy. That hasn't always worked out the way that science has promised, the way modernism, I should say, has promised. But the way that we seek truth is through the correct application of method. Method was seen as objective, which is another problem that postmodernism is going to critique. Method cannot be purely objective, and certainly not how it is implemented and interpreted. The correct application of method, i.e. research and science, will lead to progress. So there's this confidence, again, that we will make progress through science. Science builds upon science. So there's this foundational approach to knowledge that we build upon on our basic foundations. There's a similar idea in premodernism that our basic foundations will reveal knowledge, and we build upon that. In the modernist period, science builds upon science, and we make the progress through our application and understanding of science. Transition to modernism. Again, we get the crisis of epistemology and the emergence of pluralism. You can see this in some of the writings of William James. The crisis of authority, and in postmodernism, there is no authorities that we can really trust. There is, meanings are much more difficult to hold on to, and they're not seen as universal, and the security is not there. This is one of the reasons why there was a period of anxiety around this transition. This is, I think, part of what Rollo May was speaking to in his book, The Cry for Myth. And he talks about the anxiety and that we've given up a lot of our myths. Now, for May, myth is not something that is not true, but something that cannot be proven to be true. Think about that logos and mythos that we talked about before. The mythos is truth is not literal truth. That's what the way that May is going to think about it here. Myths are not literal truths, but they are truths. And so the cry for myth, he's talking about this transition from modernism, postmodernism, at least in my interpretation of this book. This is what he's talking about, and the loss of myth. The myth, in this sense, was a lot of the myths that are connected to ways of knowing and truth. The myth was science. Again, it's not that science is false, but that science is not proven true. Science is not proved nearly as much as what we think that it might do. There's still always interpretation there. And so this transition of myth creates a lot of anxiety because our basic foundations have been undermined. Now this is just a quote that I really like from a musical artist you maybe heard of, India Ari, that seems to fit here. The art of simplicity is simply making peace with our complexity. So postmodernism. Epistemology is epistemological pluralism and epistemological diversity. And what this means is that it's best for us to use multiple ways of knowing. We should not trust any one way of knowing. In pre-modern times, we focus on one way of knowing. In modern times, we work towards these, there's a limited number of ways of knowing that got integrated over time, and science is our primary way of knowing towards the end. So there's more narrow conceptions of the way of knowing. Now, of course, again, there's plenty of exceptions in there, and there was exceptions to certain content areas, maybe in academies, so maybe science doesn't apply to religion. Yes, we understand all of that, but still there were more narrow understandings of the superior ways of knowing, the most important ways of knowing. And now, that's beginning to change with postmodernism, that we should look at it through different ways of knowing. Now, when we apply this in the field of psychology, for example, we might say, well, we know better by using mixed methods, using quantitative and qualitative research, as well as theory, as well as focusing on individual subjective experience, as well as focusing on clinical knowledge and interpretation, as well as trusting our intuition to some degree. So by integrating these different ways of knowing, we get a better understanding. Now, some will say that by using multiple ways of knowing, we better approximate truth. Not all people that identify as postmodernism are going to agree with that, because some will say there is no truth to be approximated. But for some, we better approximate truth by using multiple ways of knowing. So the methodology is mixed, interdisciplinary. We want to look at it through different lenses. And the over-reliance on any one way of knowing is viewed with great suspicion. Authority is questioned and distributed. And what, to a degree, could be seen as the new authority is more of a collective or a cultural authority, a social group authority. But there's a lot of questioning of any primary sources of power, any individuals. Anyone that claims too much authority is not trusted. Now, when we think about premodernism, postmodernism, some of the ideas of spirituality that we see today, as well as some of the integrations of different approaches to different world religions and different types of spirituality, these are other things that we can see as premodernism and postmodernism. Modernism and postmodernism, well, science is a way of knowing. It is still valued from a postmodernist perspective. This is a misunderstanding that sometimes really drives me nuts, is that people believe that postmodernists are anti-science. No, there may be some postmodernists that are anti-science, but most people that ascribe more of a postmodern perspective value science, but they also recognize science has its own limitations as well. So science is understood as a way of knowing, not the way of knowing. So there are different ways of knowing in postmodernism that can include pre-modern and modern ways of knowing. Postmodern is not discounting these earlier ways of knowing, earlier developed ways of knowing. It's integrating them as a way of knowing in a broader context. So who will save us? Well, it's varied. Maybe no one, maybe our culture, We don't know, maybe ourselves, but we don't look to science or religion or God necessarily to say this. As I talked about before, the early phase of postmodernism was deconstructing modernism. And I would argue that many misunderstand postmodernism because they are just stuck in this phase. They're stuck understanding postmodernism as this first phase of development, the deconstruction. But there was more of a constructive phase. And we see many types of postmodernism emerging. There was different types of modernism, different types of premodernism that all were fairly consistent with the basic epistemology, but there was some variance in them as well. On postmodernism, there also is these variances in ways of knowing. And so there are various ways of putting this together as the constructive phase came around. So what we see is there are many different postmodernisms. When we talk about postmodernism in a very general sense, we can think there are many different types of postmodernism that fall under that broader umbrella. Some of the more well-known are approaches such as constructivism. And there's personal constructivism, social constructivism, variations within there. There also are some narrative approaches that can be understood as being very postmodern. So now we're seeing that there is the development of a lot more constructive ways. There's more of a development of methodology, and we're starting to also see methodology developing through this idea of mixed methods. So there's development of the epistemologies, what's meant by there, and the methodologies, how we use them together to move towards better understandings, which may be approximating truth or may be looking at truth as in different ways, such as within cultural context or individual context. So some misconceptions then about postmodernism is one, postmodernism is unified. No, it's not unified. There are many different postmodernisms. We just covered that. Second, postmodernism is relativism. Postmodernism is not relativism. You will have likely heard this, you may hear this, it's not relativism. It's different. It's confusing this idea of something that is relativistic with relativism. Relativism is really saying, but of course there's different interpretations even of relativism, but what relativism is really saying that everything is equal. That's not what postmodernism tends to be saying. It's rather saying things relativistic. We can't know. We can approximate. We can only know within a cultural context. So there is truth within postmodernism. It just looks a little different than in modernism. And there's not as much trust that we know it absolutely. There's a recognition of the limitations there. Postmodern as being no such, that's not worded well there, but postmodernism saying there's no such thing as universal truth. Well, this varies. Some in postmodernism will say, yes, absolutely, there's universal truths. Others will say, no, there's not. If we go back to that religious example, we can take the example of God. Well, God can be seen as ultimate truth that exists out there. But what postmodernism will say is we can never know or understand God in God's terms. So we always have to understand God in human terms, which is going to be less than perfect. Now, if you're familiar with Plato, you can think about how this can be applied in various ways with this idea of this realm of the forms and then what we have here on earth. As what we have here on earth is never as perfect as this world of forms. So we can think of it in that way. With science, postmodernism would say that maybe there are truths that we can discover, but we may not fully understand them. And when you think about how science has changed the way it's interpreted and understood many concepts that are considered very factual by many that take more of a belief in ultimate truth, our understanding of those have changed. And probably will continue to change some over time. So there's always limitations to how much we can know the universal truths, the ultimate truths, if they do exist. And maybe they exist in fewer places than we'd like to believe. So this would be the postmodern perspective. It is not saying there's no such thing as universal truth, absolutely. Some may say that, but as a whole, postmodernism does not say that. It's more skeptical in our ability to know that. And then, as we've talked about several times, postmodernism is not just deconstructivism. Language is often talked about in postmodernism. It can be a good illustration, so we're going to wrap up looking a little bit at language. And this is a quote from John Frederickson. "We cannot know the world directly or objectively, but only through language and concepts which we have invented. We are not able to compare our thoughts with any objective reality because we are unable to transcend the limits of our concepts and language. Hence, all our knowledge of the world is determined by constructs." So this, hopefully you can see how this is very similar to what I was just mentioning with the idea of ultimate truth. We can't know the world. The world maybe represents a type of ultimate truth. We can't know it directly or objectively, but only through our language, through our concepts, through how we can interpret it in our brain. These are the ways that we know the world, and there's always limitations inherent in these. When we look at linguistics across these periods, in premodernism, there's a prepositional understanding. In other words, there is a true understanding of language, of a term, of an idea, and it's determined by God. In modernism, there's more of a prepositional understanding of language, but it's set by those in authority or those in the know. But there's a big shift in language when we get to postmodernism, because now language is understood as socially constructed. It evolves over time. So one of the things that's often done in academic writing over time is there is a tendency to trace words to their origin. Now, from a postmodern perspective, that does not make as much sense, because language is socially constructed and changes over time. That going back to the original definition as a way of claiming authority is more of a pre-modern and modern way of approaching language. It's not to say that it can't be very useful to look at the history of language, the history of words, and see how they've changed and evolved over time. But from a postmodern sense, it doesn't make sense to debate over the correct terminology. Rather, it's important to be clear about how we're using terms. That does create challenges and problems, certainly, and it's important for us to have some agreement about how we use terms in certain contexts. But the idea that there is an ultimate truth connected with language, that is more thrown aside in postmodernism. And so instead of debating definitions and terms, it's better for us to understand how they're being used and what they're pointing to. Okay, so this wraps up the lecture on this. I know a lot was covered very quickly in a short amount of time. Again, I know that there are exceptions to everything that I talked about in this lecture. You could find examples to contradict basically everything that I said in this lecture. From a postmodern perspective, that's okay. But also, remember, what we're trying to do is look at broad sweeps. And if you look at this over time, hopefully you can begin to see how things change a bit over time. Now, where it becomes interesting as well is when we start to talk about different psychological theories. One of the things I would hope that you would try to do is hold in your consciousness as you're reading through these different theories where they fit with this pre-modern, modern, postmodern, and how this is relevant. So as you look at the theories, as you look at how the theories have changed over time, and we'll talk about some of these as we go forward. For example, psychoanalysis is a great example of how it's changed over time. Early psychoanalysis was very modern and even had some certain pre-modern influences, it seems, at times, with the direct revelation being more through Freud in some ways. But it's very pre-modern and modern. But there's been a postmodern turn in psychoanalysis that is very interesting and has brought around a third wave in psychoanalysis. It can be we're seen in relational psychoanalysis and in subjectivity in psychoanalysis, and social constructive perspectives in psychoanalysis. So there we can see how it's changed over time. We can see other approaches, such as behaviorism, how it really reflects a very modernist approach. So pay attention to these over time. The other thing I want you to pay attention to is how do these differences play out in our culture? How do they play out with people that may be our clients if you're a therapist or if you're a consultant? For example, what happens if you have a couple that comes into therapy and one's a premodernist and one's a postmodernist? Well, that can get challenging, particularly when children come into the picture. And how do you raise your children? Or a modernist and postmodernist, or a modernist and a premodernist. And we see this today, even though most premodernism that you see today is a lot different than the premodernism of premodern times. It's changed, it's evolved. So using that with, it's important to use that with some caution in labeling people premodernist, modernist, postmodernist, because these will emanate differently in contemporary times than they would historically. But we can start to see this when we look at our political dialogues and debate. Well, some of the reasons why our political dialogues and debates that get so heated today is because they're really about epistemology and our ways of knowing. There's different assumptions. So you have these arguments and people come out with completely different interpretations of debates. Well, it's because there's different understandings of truth and how we know truth. So different arguments are going to be more persuasive. So there are times when, in order for us to have constructive conversations, we have to step back and look at our epistemologies and see how our epistemologies are influencing our conversations. Similarly, with clients, we may have to have them step back sometimes and look at the ways they know. Now, I wouldn't suggest talking with clients about epistemology most of the time. It may work with some, but typically if you start talking about, well, your marital conflict is really about epistemology, you're probably not going to come back. But there's ways you can talk about this without using that language, particularly as you get to know it better. But you can use this as a lens to help understand, this is where the breakdown is occurring. So again, we're going to keep coming back to this and looking at this throughout the term. Hopefully as we go through the term and you start to apply these, they'll make more sense to you if you're not already familiar with these. So we'll look forward to having more discussions about this as the term progresses.